One, two, three.
What's up, everyone, and welcome back to school. But don't worry, everything is cool. I'm your host, Shalissa, and of course, I'm here with the boys, Steve and Brandon. Say what's up, you guys.
What's up?
And we got a special guest today. We got the founder of LatinX Parenting, Leslie Priscilla. What's up? How you doing?
Doing so good. I'm so happy to be here with y'all.
How you feeling?
I feel good.
Feel good?
It's a little bit of a drive, but it was good. It was worth it. It's already worth it.
Yeah, you're coming from Orange County, right?
Santana.
Santana.
I have to be specific because
Okay.
Santana is very different.
Represent.
Than the rest of Orange
Represent.
County.
Is it really what makes it different?
We're 78% Mexican American.
Oh,
in Santana.
wow.
Yeah, I was born, raised there, and so I'm surrounded by, like, they call it Little Mexico sometimes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear
That's
Orange
cool.
County too. It's like one of the most conservative places in California, right?
Yes, very red, and that's still in Santana politics, but
Mhm.
you know, for the most part, we're all raza, and yeah,
Oh,
it feels
wow.
good.
Oh.
Everybody speaks Spanish.
Yeah, I have a couple of friends from there, and then my boyfriend's from Orange County. But my friend grew up in Santana, and then she moved to Garden Grove. So, like, I know that area a little more
Yeah,
because of, like, my friends there. So that's pretty cool.
come on down.
It's
I'm
cool.
down to see
It's
it.
cool.
Yeah,
Good.
definitely.
Yeah, I'm
Good
surprised I haven't
times.
heard more about it since it's called Little Mexico, especially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
Has a lot of history.
That's
A lot of important history.
Any cool fun facts right now that you could share with the audience?
I feel like I would want to ask Fernando, my partner, who's here with us. Any
Yeah.
fun facts about
He's
Yeah.
Santana?
he's off the screen.
Yeah,
He's
off
here.
screen we have. She has her partner here.
Yeah. We'll do.
He'll be
fun,
back.
Fun fact: I live there.
Fun fact. You
She's
grew
like,
up
I'm
there.
from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so to get into it about a little bit more about yourself, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit about like your personal journey and what inspired you to create Latinx Parenting.
Yeah, that's a great start. I feel like I was a parent before I was actually a parent. I feel like my little sister was kind of like my first entry into parenting.
Uh-huh.
And I felt very responsible for her when I was 9. She was born when I was 9.5, so we're almost 10 years apart. My mom wasn't really like in an emotional, mental space at that time to be able to be a mom to her or to me for that matter. And so I knew from that age very early on that I wanted something different for her than what I was experiencing at the time. And so because my mom was not emotionally there because of everything that she was going through, she was very much in survival, which a lot of our parents are, that I felt like I had to kind of take on that caregiver role for her. So in Encanto, when Luisa's singing, like, I'm the older sister, like, I'm like, I so relate to that because I really felt like I wanted to, you know, be responsible for her growth and development. And so fast forward to me in college, learning about child development, learning about psychology, and really thinking about how much of an impact parenting makes and the adults around a child's life makes. And also looking at all of this information in the psychology that I felt like my parents didn't have access to, my mom didn't have access to. There wasn't a lot of time for her either. There wasn't a lot of resources like we have now. And that led me into being a preschool teacher. And as I started working with kids, I was like, oh my gosh, like these kids are going home and they're coming back to me with a lot of the same, you know, quote unquote behavioral issues that I'm sending them home with. Something's happening at home. And then towards the end, towards the end of being a preschool teacher, when I finally transferred into university to complete my degree, I got pregnant. And so I remember going to orientation at Cal State Long Beach, and I was like, every bathroom I would stop because I had like really bad morning sickness. And I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this. And then I gave birth to my daughter. And when I looked at her, I was like, this is the most perfect, precious being that I've ever seen. And I cannot imagine ever hurting this child, like ever doing anything that would harm her or make her suffer or struggle. And in that same moment, I kind of recognized that about myself, like being worthy of that same thing. And that was really, really big for me because I didn't have that as a blueprint, right? I was like, I know exactly how I don't want to be because at that point, my mom and I had a really, really bad relationship. Like she was still struggling, has been in survival most of her life. My mom is one of 12 kids that came from Mexico. She was 14 years old when she crossed the border. She was deported a few times and then finally made her way to California, met my dad, and then she did okay. He's a white Latino, and so she kind of like married up into a little bit more privilege by being married to him. But her experience was not easy. As you know, a child being raised with 12 other siblings, she had to take care of the younger ones like from very early on too. So she didn't really have much of a childhood, right? So when we think about our parents, I'm like, how can we expect our parents to know the value of children when they were not really valued in their childhood?
Yeah.
And so the more I, was raising my daughter, the more I thought about those things, and the more unfair I felt that my parents didn't have that ability to kind of reflect and think about the ways that they were parented, and how that would have made an impact to me, right? So I started reading a lot of parenting books around that time when my daughter was a baby. And I was like, this sounds great. Yeah, eye contact, cool. Like, get down on their level. Awesome. Like, be really connected to them. Okay. Why didn't I get that?
Yeah.
Right? Why didn't I get the nurturing, the validating, the loving, kind parent that I saw in like Full House? Like I wanted that. Yeah. And so I think that being exposed to that kind of media too, and then having friends that didn't have that disconnected relationship from their parents, has started making me kind of think again about like why. So there was all this question of like, ¿por qué? Right? And then how do I, without a blueprint, without an example of raising a child from that emotionally loving place, how do I do that? And reading those books and saying like, this is all valuable. I am going to take this. And at the same time, I really want to make this accessible to other people. And so that's kind of where the journey started. I started teaching parents shortly thereafter. I was trained as a parenting coach in 2013. And I went into a mental health agency called the Child Abuse Prevention Center. And I started working with parents 7 classes a week, 2-hour classes. Most of them were Latino families. I was teaching in Spanish. But I was working with a lot of different kinds of demographics, and I just started noticing these patterns of like hurt people, right? Just really like wounded humans, whether they were in rehabilitation centers or whether they were in elementary schools. I'm like, all of these people deserve peace, ease, like access to feeling good, and so I kind of started to ask like what my role in that was beyond working in a mental health agency, because they didn't really value the work that I wanted to do. Like they were just like, you just go, you teach the curriculum, you do what we tell you. And if you say that you want something different, like, no, you're going to have to do this job. And so after a while I got burnt out from that agency, and, but I still wanted to work with parents. And in 2018, I founded LatinX Parenting. I was also working at another mental health agency. I never stopped teaching parents when I started in 2013. I was, moving everything out of my master bedroom and having a group of parents just in my master bedroom and teaching them there. I was like, I have to keep doing this because these conversations are so important. I want to talk about trauma. I want to talk about healing. I want to talk about brain development. I want to talk about the beauty of our culture, not just the pain, right? And how do we get there? So yeah, Latinx Parenting was born, and it's been a wild ride ever since.
Oh, wow. And what have you learned so far through all that? I know it's a lot. Well, because I have been reading like your articles and different things that you like mention, and to me, I just think about it of like how like you parenting and like creating this like organization, and also you also being a parent within it. Like, how is it like juggling both those things?
It's hard. Like I won't lie. It's been a lot of learning. I think when I had that moment with my daughter and I was like, I would never hurt her. I would never. Yeah, I've hurt her feelings now. She's 11 and a half, like there have been times where I slip into my own wounds. So it's been a lot of learning humility. A lot of compassion has grown for my mom that I don't think I had when I first started, when I was a preschool teacher. And I was like, how could anyone hurt a child, right?
Yeah.
And now being in my body as I'm raising 3 kids, so my older is 11 and a half, my younger 2 are 5 and a half and 4. And so, yeah, you get to points sometimes as a parent, right? Where you're just like, I was hit. And so my impulse, my instinct is going to be to hit. And it takes everything in me sometimes to not do that, to not fall back into those patterns. Yeah. And so I just have so much compassion for parents. I think that's another thing that I've learned, just like, you don't know, like we don't know anybody's story, and we can't come into a relationship with a parent, in my work, for example, thinking of them as a bad parent, right? Because I actually don't believe that people are born bad. I think that environment has so much to do with what people become and how people evolve.
Yeah.
And there's a lot there, right? It's like, what do I mean when I say environment? Like, it's the home environment, but it's also the community. It's also the systems around it. It's the history. That's another thing that I hadn't learned, I think, when I first started, is the impact of colonization and the impact of, you know, a lot of the oppressive systems that our families have had to navigate that other demographics maybe haven't had to navigate as intensely.
Yeah.
I think that has been huge for me, right? And has also allowed me to gain more compassion for parents, because I'm like, our familias, our comunidad has not had access to the layers of privilege that other groups have had. And so it's made parenting harder.
Yeah, I feel like what you're mentioning, it makes me think a lot of like my mom, of like, I mean, I'm not a parent yet, but I did eventually growing up, and especially like going into college and stuff, I started realizing a lot more, like my mom has a lot of trauma that like, and like I used to grow up like going, because I used to follow them a lot when I was younger. So like when we go to like family parties and stuff, like I would always hear the stories that she would tell, like her comadres and all that, like about how she lived and how she grew up in Mexico. And like, and then also like when we would go visit our her brothers or my uncle, and how she would talk about how like my mom got abandoned by my grandma and stuff. And so like I got to hear a lot of the stories of the way that she lived when she was young. And I feel like I always felt for her. Like I always like, I knew that how the way she grew up was wrong, but I never like understood that really affected her as a mom. Like I think at a young age, like I knew that like it was horrible, but I didn't know that like that hurt her, which was hurting me. And I didn't understand that. Because I still remember one time when I got really, really mad at her. And I remember being like, well, my mom doesn't know. Like, she never went to school, so she doesn't get the struggle. And, like, I remember thinking that because I was so mad at her that she didn't get, like, where I was coming from. Because I was like, because in my head, I remember being like, we grew up so differently, and that's why she doesn't get it. Like, she doesn't understand me. And, like, I just remember being so angry. And then as I kept growing up and, like, going to college, and for college, I went away, so I was on my own. And so, like, I just started, like, seeing a lot more that, like, my mom lived through a lot of trauma that I didn't understand. And then that's why eventually growing up and now as an adult, I feel like I understand it a lot more, and I kind of learned to forgive her for the things that she did when I was younger. And I feel like because for me, I grew up very resentful. Like, I'm very, like, I hold on. Like, if somebody does something bad to me, I hold on to it. And like, of course, like my parents, you know, like they're parents, they're gonna be a certain way with their kids. And I feel like I started growing resentment towards them as I grew up. And then eventually kind of just hit me. And I was like, I think they were only like raising us the best way that they could, because also like learning different circumstances of like both of my parents didn't have a dad. They mostly just grew up with their moms, but like my dad didn't really grow up with my grandma. Like he actually lived with like his uncles. And my mom, like, again, like my grandma left her for like a good amount of her years. So she didn't really like have even my grandma with her either. So it was like seeing all those things, I started understanding a lot more that I was just like, there's just trauma. And like the good thing that I learned about my mom was that like she did grow up in a very abusive household, but she was already like, she had already said to herself that she didn't want to pass that down to her kids. So, like, she did her best on raising us and not being like our grandma or like her grandma, right? Because she was also raised by our great grandma, who was also super abusive compared to like my actual grandma. So, like, to me, yeah. So, to me, it was just like a big realization of like being more understanding as a kid that like our parents went through a lot of trauma, and just understanding that fact that like, and because to me, it was more like learning to forgive them for like what they did. And I did. And I feel like I've been trying my best to, I guess, create that relationship between us again. Like, again, like I'm not a parent yet. And I know that that's something that my mom really wants to be a grandma. But I feel like right now my goal is really to, I guess, fix our relationship before like anything else happens within my life.
Yeah, it's insane to watch too, because we both have a nephew. And seeing the generations of people trying to fix whatever generational trauma was passed on to us, it's a beautiful privilege to see it now with the newest, like iteration of our family with a Valentine.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful because that's one of the things that stuck out for me when I looked into Latinx parenting, is that when you heal a child and you help them grow in healthy ways, in a way, it also heals yourself. And I see that with my nephew because he's a boy, like I was a boy. And so I try to make sure that he feels seen and he feels validated in his emotions, because that's another beautiful thing that I wanted to point out too, that I've seen through your program in your organization, is that I think we underestimate the intelligence of a lot of children. I think that we should offer them the same respect that we offer a lot of adults. You even had a slide, I think, where you pointed it out about how we expect sometimes children to act in ways that we wouldn't expect adults not to act with, which is like, oh, if an adult is angry, we would expect for them to be angry about it. But for a child, we don't allow that to happen. And I think that's kind of beautiful, because I think it's really painting a perspective for me where I realize that this relationship that I have with my nephew, he may not be my son, but he's offering me this like almost like therapeutic experience just because I'm helping raise him too in a communal way. And that's just like a shout out to some of the cool things that I noticed on your posts that really helped me like make that realization. I thought that was very beautiful.
I'm just taking it in, taking it in, because I think what each of you have shared is so powerful, and it really speaks to, even if you're not a parent, right? And whenever someone's like, oh, I'm not a parent yet, I'm like, because I practice like inner child work, I'm like, you actually are a nurturer to that part of yourself that's still there, you know? And that's one of the approaches that I take, is like, we can reconnect to that part of ourselves that knows that we deserve the validation, the love, the nurturance, the discipline sometimes, because some of us were not disciplined. Some of our parents were so stressed out. They were like, you go watch TV over there. I'm going to be over here. Like, no discipline, right? Yeah. And so it's really about what that part of ourselves still needs. Something I wanted to speak to that you had shared was that every generation is doing a little bit better. And when my mom saw the name of the Chancla culture movement, I had to explain it to her, and she was like, yo quisiera que me habían dado con la chancla. Like, I wish that they had hit me with la chancla, because what I got was la soga, el palo, like all of these other things that were so much more painful. So it's true that she came into mothering me wanting better for me, and that wasn't necessarily what I needed. Like, I definitely got hit. I got el gancho. I don't remember getting la chancla, but I got other items that. And I wasn't actually, in all of my cousins, like, it wasn't the worst for me. My mom grew up pretty removed. All of my cousins lived in Riverside. And so she wasn't really the most abusive of the tias, right? And as I say that, I'm like, I have a tia in mind. But I think a lot of us do. You know, a lot of us in our families were like, oh, yeah, like, you know, that was kind of the threat. When, si te portas mal, vas a irte con tu tía, etc. And so it's a lot of fear, right? Like, we have a lot of fear, and our parents oftentimes raised us in those ways because they were afraid of what the world was going to do to us. And I think because of their experience, and I think people who are darker skinned than me, like, there is this fear that's very valid that, you know, if I don't raise you right, if I don't give you the limitations that the world is going to give you, and if you fight against me, that means you're going to fight against the world, and you could get killed. You literally could get killed. And we've seen that happen many times. And so my message is, we have to begin to build the world that we are wanting to see, and not the world that we are not wanting to see, right? We have to have a better vision for ourselves. And I think what helps me is to look backwards in order to look forward. Because there was a point in time when our families were not this impacted by all of the systemic stressors, right? And so we have to kind of think back to, what did that look like? That looked like reconnection to the land, reconnection to collectivism. That looked like pueblos, I mean, like villages, right, where we were taking care of each other, like you were talking about. So there's a lot there when we speak to, like, how do we move forward, right? Like, how do the new generations move forward? Because a lot of this is also not even in our brains. Like, we can think it through, but then when you start raising that child, and your child raises their voice at you, or they start to have a tantrum, it almost feels like sometimes you don't have control, right? Sometimes it feels like, oh my gosh, I'm so like overwhelmed in my own body that I want to hit this child, that I want to do something to get them to respect me, or whatever it is. And so it takes a lot of strength, even for somebody like me who, you know, had a schooling education and who graduated with a degree. Like, it's hard for me. Imagine how hard it was for our parents. You know, imagine how hard it was for our grandparents who oftentimes didn't have an awareness of like where they were going to feed their kids the next week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, and I always think of just different like circumstances of just like everything. Like everything is different, and I think especially now the hard part is just people don't like change, or people are so stuck in like. And also, I always feel like a lot of the generations sometimes are like, oh, I grew up this way, so you kind of have to grow up in the same way. And like some people are kind of stuck in that mindset, and it's good to see that there is that wanting of change though. And I also wanted to go into another question. So I wanted to know how you approach issues of like cultural diversity within the Latinx community and ensure that your platform is inclusive to various backgrounds and experiences. Because I know you mentioned a little bit about how you go into different demographics and stuff. So I kind of wanted to know how kind of you do that within the Latinx community and then also kind of outside of it.
Yeah. So the term Latinx, right? Like when we're talking about what that means, it's like all the countries under the border that was drawn, right? Mm-hmm. So there's going to be so many diverse experiences and so many diverse stories that I went into it recognizing like I am not the sole representation of like what a Latina mom or what a Latinx parent is.
Yeah.
And I think in that first year, 2 years after starting the page, a lot started emerging about those identities that I didn't necessarily fit. One of those was brown dads, right? One of those was fathers who wanted to be represented. Mm-hmm. The next one was LGBTQIA. Mm-hmm. And then in the summer of 2020, the conversation around colorism in the Latinx community really started, popping off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had already been talking about those things, but there wasn't a lot of attention on it. It wasn't until something happened where we started talking more about that. And so for me, it's been really important to kind of identify like where my blind spots are. I think that you have helped me a lot with that. Because I get very like, no, así va a ser, like it's going to be like this.
Yeah.
And he's like, I don't know. I don't think that you're thinking it through. Mm-hmm. But I think, it's extremely important for us to be able to kind of honor every story. Like there's so much diversity to all of our histories. And at the same time, all of our families were impacted by this historical event of colonization. So there's a very strong thread also. And this is why you get all kinds of people laughing at La Chancla memes. This is why you get people relating on certain music or certain like aspects of the culture, because those things do tie us together. Mm-hmm. But we also want to recognize that there are individual stories that have not been told, and group stories within the Latinx community that have not been told.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned like the chancla memes and stuff. So you had said that you think those are like basically us kind of like going backwards, or what would you say within that? Because I know you've mentioned it like a couple of times, and I've read it in like your articles and stuff that you say about like the memes and the videos and all that.
Yeah, so I loved them. Like I loved Chancla memes and videos. When George Lopez came out with his "Why You Crying" stand-up, I was like, this is so good because I finally relate, to somebody that's on a stage talking about the way my family is. And it felt really good, like it felt like finally I feel this sense of belonging, this sense of connection, like I feel affirmed in my history and my experience. Yeah. And then as I started learning a little bit more and I started having those reflections that I was talking about earlier, where I was like, I don't necessarily want that though. Like, I don't really want it to be normal in my family to hit a kid. I don't really want anybody really to think that that is the normal way of being and engaging with kids. Yeah. And that was my hesitation actually with starting Latinx parenting, because I was like, I don't know if my people are ready for this conversation. I don't know if we can get to have a very honest dialogue about how respeto and miedo are different. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we can get to that. And I'm so glad that I eventually did. And I was affirmed that, people are ready for this conversation. But when it comes to the chancla memes, I knew that me kind of coming out against La Chancla was going to cause some shit. Yeah.
Controversy.
Some controversy. Yeah. And so I started kind of exploring. I was like, where does this come from? Like, where are we, how has this become like the normal thing? It appeared in Coco, right? Like in Coco, you have the abuela with the chancla. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we made it into Disney with the chancla. Like, that's impressive. But La Chancla is honestly just kind of like an entry into the conversation of parents and children, right? And how parents raise children, and how oftentimes a lot of our mamas, a lot of our abuelas didn't really feel like they had a choice by the point that they picked up a chancla, right? And that speaks to the stress that they were under. And so my goal is like, let's get to the point where our families are not so stressed out that they feel like they have to pick up a chancla in order to get some kind of cooperation from their kids or from their family. And I also know that this is not just a Latinx problem. Like, this is around the world. The way that children are treated is awful. A lot of it was influenced by European colonization in all these different parts of the world. I've had so many people from all kinds of cultures in my DMs being like, we have a chancla culture, and we have a, we have a this, we have a that. For us, it was la cuchara. Like, there's so many diverse stories. And so I'm not knocking like the connection that those memes offer to us, but I am wanting to invite people to kind of think about it a little bit deeper, so that we don't normalize violence as a part of our familias, because the message has been, this is just how we are. Like, this is just the culture. This is just the way our families are. And if you're rejecting it, then you're rejecting the culture. And I've learned so much that now I'm like, you don't really know what you're talking about. Like, this comes from a history of being oppressed for our people. And we picked it up, we adapted it into our families, but it didn't start that way.
I was gonna say, because like I grew up a lot hearing, like, my parents always told us stories when we would go to Mexico and stuff, and then I remember they would always point out like a plant, and they'd be like, oh, this plant, my grandma would always just pull it out, and that's what she would like hit us with. And it was always just like stories about that. And I never, again, like I grew up hearing those stories, but I never heard anything like wrong with them. I was just like, what? You guys grew up like that? Like, that's crazy. That's how I kind of just like grew up seeing it and stuff. But I kind of wanted you to kind of go more into that, where you're talking about just like the way, because you say that I guess it's coming from like our parents being stressed and stuff. So going a little more into that, like, what do you mean specifically with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think about like what would have happened if my mom didn't have to leave her hometown in Mexico to come to the U.S. to work, to help feed her younger 6 siblings. Like, what would that life had looked like for her if she had had an adolescence, if she had access to all the things that we want for our kids now, right? And that wasn't the case. So from very early on, she had to have this traumatic experience that is immigration. And honestly, immigration is very traumatic for a lot of our families. There's loss of culture, there's loss of language, there's inadequacy that our parents experience when they come here, and they don't understand the system, that the new culture. And so when we're born, we're like straddling these cultures, but for them, that can be a very stressful experience in the body. Not just like it's in my mind, but it's just like I am so activated by everything around me, and poverty affects us so much more, and mental health issues, and not only the mental health issues, but we're not talking about the mental health issues, right? So it's like it's there, but we don't talk about Bruno, another Encanto reference. But to have that level of stress for some of our parents, often working 2 jobs, if they were Afro-Latino, that is another layer of stress, because they're experiencing discrimination and racism wherever they go. The way that I was treated when I was just with my friends who were white was very different than me walking into that same space with my mom, who looks like an indígena, like who looks like a brown woman. And so having experienced that, I was like, that shit sucks. Like, that's stressful for that parent. I can't imagine walking into, a grocery store and being like afraid because I don't know the language, and I'm worried that my kids are going to get taken away from me if they have a tantrum, and the security is going to look at me funny. So yeah, I'm going to look at you and I'm going to be like, cállate o te voy a dar con la chancla, or cállate o te voy a meter unos chingazos. Like, that makes sense. It makes sense that when parents are that desperate, when they're that stressed out, that they're going to operate from that stress and from that woundedness that also comes from childhood.
It was something that reminds me of my parents come from a small business. And my mom always talked about how she felt as though a lot of customers that would come wouldn't offer her respect the same way they would offer my dad. And most of the people that we would be like customers with were people who were from like immigrants just like us. And so I do think that's another layer of it too, is that my mother, despite how independent she grew up, when she came here to the States, it felt like it all just kind of fell back to square one because nobody would offer her the same like human decency that you would offer somebody who, if they were a guy. And I think that's like what it's making me think about right now, because I imagine then when you're raising two boys, I have an older brother, I imagine she kind of has that in mind, and she tried to instill in us to always have respect, especially because we had a sister. So I think it just keeps going back to the more you learn about parenting, the more you kind of learn that you start to compare your own way of growing up, and then you compare the way of the future, and it inspires you to try to become just a better person. And it's not like making me want to like, oh, I should have a kid right now. But it's definitely like almost falling on that line of like, there's a lot of healing properties that you get when you at least raise a child, whether it's yours or, like I said, my nephew.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Oh no, you go.
No, I thought it was really interesting how you spoke about earlier that there's an aspect of Chancla culture that is adopted from a sense of colonization. I know it's not my turn. I'm sorry.
No,
I just wondered if you could go into that more, because I think that's really interesting, because I was wondering where that comes from, where that's adopted from, because what I think about is when my dad, when he went to Catholic school, he went in a time when the nuns and the teachers could hit you. So he talks to me about that all the time when, it's like, he talks about how sadistic the nuns were. They'd put your hands out and they'd hit you with a ruler. So that's just what I was thinking of. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the decolonization and the colonial roots of.
Yeah, I'm deep in that right now because I'm writing my book. And so the second chapter it's called The Root of Harm. And I'm maybe giving away too much right now, but there are connections to religion, right? The Catholic Church sanctioned the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the America 500 years ago. That's going to have an impact on us now because of the way that creates, different changes in our bodies and our genetics, et cetera. A lot of what I have learned has been from people that are doing this work with Black families. And so the way that slavery still shows up in the genetics of Black people and Black family dynamics have taught me a lot about what that looks like in our families. And so unfortunately, there's not a ton of research about how indigenous peoples in the Americas treated children in pre-colonial times, because all the evidence that we have was like within the first 200 years, right? We have like the codexes, and so that shows. But we still have indigenous cultures now that don't believe in corporal punishment, that believe in involving children in the collaboration of a child into the family. I've learned also a lot from Andrea Landry of Indigenous motherhood and kinship systems, right? So no one is disposable, no one is dispensable. We stay together as a family unit. A lot of the children in our families historically were removed from the family and taken into the Catholic Church. I mean, they talk about residential schools in Canada, but that was all over the continent. That was not just in Canada, right? And so when you think about what happened to our people and what our people had to do to survive, that's where machismo comes from. That's where anti-Blackness in our cultura comes from too. I'm going to align into whiteness because if I don't, I'm going to have a harder life or I'm going to die. And then my kids will die. Like that was a very real thing. And so when we talk about adapting oppression into our families, or what I call chancla culture, it speaks to the fact that a lot of us felt like we only had the choice to raise our children in a violent way because that's what we were getting. And if we didn't raise our kids to speak Spanish, for example, that was going to not fare well for the family, right? And so I would rather beat you into submission than sacrifice you to the colonizer.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because when we look at intergenerational trauma, about how just a few generational backs and some of their stories still affect us, I imagine even 500 years ago or more, all those ideas and stories of colonization, they still affect us to this day.
It's only 20 generations.
Really?
It's only 20 generations. I think that's wild. I'm like,
yeah, no, that is wild.
That's 2 times 10. Like, that's not,
Yeah.
I mean, considering that we have evidence of having been on this land over, I've seen different numbers, but the number that stands out the most to me is 13,000 years, like in our current, you know, indigenous forms, like about 13,000 years. And of that, it's only been 500 years of colonization. And that to me is mind blowing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just like, wow, like, and everything that happened as a result of that colonization, great migrations, which are still happening, the borderlines being drawn. It's in the words of one of my teachers, it has done a number on us. Like it has really, really messed with our families. And there's a way to go back, right? There's a way to go forward by going back, like I said, where we don't necessarily have to listen to that colonizer voice in our head, where we can question and we can say, where does this come from? Why am I scared of the Black person that's on the other side of the room right now? You know, where does that come from in me? Why do I feel uncomfortable when someone tells me that they're gay? Why do I want to serve a plate of food to my son before my daughters? Things like that, right? Which come up like very unconsciously. And I'm not saying that, you know, that's me necessarily, but although I have like felt moments where I feel like, oh, my son, you know, but we get to question it, which I think is very exciting. And we have so much information now, and we have so much research, and we have the ability to connect in these ways where we can have these conversations and say, okay, we've been lied to, right? We've been lied to, we've been bamboozled. And it's time to kind of like, you know, open the rock, I guess, like just look at what's underneath, look what has happened.
Yeah. Especially for me, I think growing up, because we all went to Catholic school. And one, you did too?
My whole life, K through 12.
Oh, really? Even while you went
She
longer
went in high school.
Yeah, you went longer than we did. We were out of there 8th grade. And then I never looked back.
I was like, I don't want to go back.
No, I did. I was like, let's go. I love Jesus and and richness and whiteness, because I went to a very like privileged high school. And so I went to Modern Day High School in Santana, which is interesting because it's like right in the middle of Santana, which is like almost 80% brown. And then you have Modern Day High School, which is like 80% white. And so that was a very interesting experience. But I would love to connect on that.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting too, because I just think the Catholic Church sometimes does push like a lot of like white supremacy, especially even in its depictions of Jesus, who was someone from the Middle East. But yet he's like depicted as being very light skinned. And even in some images, he's even has like blue eyes and blonde hair. And I think it was so interesting because as a kid, I didn't make the realization that a lot of my classmates were indigenous descent kids, and yet we were kind of reliving an experience that's been going on for hundreds of years, where we were being taught like these ideas that were forced on our people. And it was so weird, because I even wondered, learning about the Native Americans as a little kid in Catholic school, and I was just thinking like, man, like it sucks that they're not around anymore, as I'm surrounded by their descendants. And I think that's so twisted, and that's why I find that so important to point out like colorism and like the white supremacist ties of religion, because I think when you start to question it, you start to reconnect more with your actual roots. And there's something beautiful in like healing that for generations, because I mean, people were just doing what they needed to do to survive. I mean, the reason why some people maybe see people who are darker skinned as like something negative is because it's just generations of being like, if you were a darker skinned person, they were going to force you to assimilate even harder, because there was something that you couldn't remove, which is what your skin was. And to me, it just goes really deep. The more I think about Catholic school, the more I'm like, that's so crazy.
Oh my gosh. My friend and I talked about having a blog, like sharing a blog and calling it Jesus Would Never. About all of the experiences that we had in Catholic school, because I'm like, how are you going to make me lose my lunchtime for carrying around a blue sweater, you know? Like, Jesus would never. But I think one of the things that makes me think of, and this is what I'm writing about in the book too, is how twisted it is that I remember having this experience. I think I was like in 5th grade, and some of us were going to be the Indians in the Thanksgiving play, and some of us were going to be the pilgrims, right? It was like, you're either going to be an Indian or a pilgrim. And I really remember being like, I better be a pilgrim. You know, I better be a pilgrim, because I knew that being a pilgrim was better than being an Indian. at that point. And sure enough, I was a pilgrim. My mom was all happy. She like made my costume. She used to work at Sizzler as a waitress. And so during that season, I would hand out cookies to some of the customers dressed in my pilgrim costume. I have pictures. Wow. I'll send it to you. I have pictures of myself, and I look at that and I'm like, that's violence. You know, like now I look at that and I'm like, how can you do that? Right? Yeah. Like, how can you romanticize yeah. And so again, like we grew up believing that the Indians and the Pilgrims had like a nice Thanksgiving meal,
best friends.
I grew up with Pocahontas, with that fine John Smith, right? I was like, I want myself a John Smith. And so lo and behold, here comes modern day, my Catholic high school, and I was just like, look at all the John Smiths, you know. It's wild. And so this is kind of what I've been realizing. And you know, I was married actually to a white man for 15 years, and my kid's dad is white. And, you know, I won't go into that too much, but there's a reason for which a lot of us are attracted to whiteness, because we were told that that was the standard. Our parents bought into that, and they didn't know that they were buying into that. Even now, when I wear my chanclas, my mom is like, ugh, eso es de India, you know, and I'm like, you are the India. Like, you are actually the India. And she recognizes it now, but I think for a lot of the older generation, to tell them those things, it feels very overwhelming, you know, or when I tell her about the spirituality that I practice now, and it is more connected to my ancestry, and it is more connected to, you know, indigenous healing practices. And she's like, eso es brujeria. And I'm just like, I don't know, like, you know, the something was here before.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, well, one thing that I thought was interesting, well, not interesting, but like, is that you talk about the romanticism of it. And one thing that I always think about, or that always is, I guess, a little haunting for me about Catholic school was, I don't know if you got it, there was a portion of Catholic school where we learned about the missions, and we had to build the missions, and we even took a field trip to a mission. And it didn't register to me at the time, you know, what the missions were about. But as I get older, that's a very, like, I don't know, that's just a haunting image for me, you know? It's almost like they're flaunting it in front of you. Where it's like, because when you stop and think about what the missions were actually supposed to do, it was just converting a bunch of Native people to and forcing the Catholic religion onto them, you know? And like, as you were talking about, like sitting in a room surrounded by people who are just indigenous and kind of like flaunting it in front of them, oh, we're going to take a field trip. And then I remember even on the field trip, they showed us how they made the bricks, you know, for the mission. And they kind of like gloss over who and how it was being made. But that kind of stuff is really, haunting, or like an interesting aspect about Catholic school. I don't think it's talked about, you know?
It creates a lot of mourning, like a lot of grief in us, you know, when we kind of think about like, oh my gosh, like I went through this. And I asked my dad recently, I was like, why did you send me to Catholic school? Like, why did I do all my sacraments? And he was like, that's just what you did. If you wanted the best for your children, that's what you did. You sent them, if you could, to Catholic school. And so it wasn't even a thought, you know, it was just like, this is what you do. I was very much following in the footsteps of my god sister and my god brother, who had gone to these schools also. But again, it was like, no, you're not going to go to the ghetto school. I ended up believing that the school next door, you know, this elementary or middle school that was a public school was ghetto. And I was like, oh, those ghetto kids over there, you know. And so it others people from this bubble of privilege that you're in. And I think going to Catholic school from K through 8, where I was mostly surrounded by other indigenous kids too, other brown kids, and then going into a high school that was very, very white, I was like, oh shit, I'm white in this space, like I'm whiter than everyone here, but I'm coming into my high school and I'm like, I'm very much not white. And my experiences are very different than these kids' experiences. And I don't have parents that own a yacht. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tustin with my mom and my sister. Like there was a lot of contrast there, you know, and I think, but I wanted to be on the side that was safer, that was better, because again, my family growing up was wounded. Like there was a lot of machismo, there was a lot of alcoholism, there was a lot of mistreatment of the women. And so going into modern day and seeing these families that were better, you know, that were just better off, they were safer, they didn't have high rates of child abuse. I didn't see their parents yelling at them the way that I saw my tios yelling at my kids. And so for me, it was like, I want something safe. I want something secure. This feels good to me right now because what I go home to is awful. And so that's another reason that I started this organization, because I'm just like, we can't look at whiteness and all of these colonial, structures as better when they have been the reason that we as Latinx people have not had access to things like safety, financial security.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's what people, when they look at it face value, that's the first thought that they have, is that white people must be better. It must be more safe to be with them because they have all of these privileges and they have all these benefits. But in reality, it's just because our people were put at a disadvantage. And I think that's something that is a hard concept for a lot of people to grasp. I mean, because I think that our country is kind of built on that foundation. And I think it's hard to like reverse it. And I think about it even in the term Indian, like my mom and my dad were telling me this about how the only reason they're called Indians were because when the Spaniards came, they thought that they had landed in India, so they called them Indians. But in reality, nobody is Indian. They're natives. They're native to the land. And I think that goes so deep because my dad and me especially, it happened a lot where throughout my life, I would meet with somebody and they're like, oh, you're Mexican? I thought you were Indian. And as growing up, it's just like, it's just one of those, like, I guess, like pet peeves is like, oh, that's not what I am. But then when you start to learn more about history, it's so crazy that that's like kind of a racist term that still is alive and well. And people aren't even aware that when they say it, it's such an offensive term because it has hundreds of years of history of when people came from the old world to the new world. That was the first thing that they thought that they were. They immediately invalidated their identity. And it sucks that even hundreds of years later, it still goes that deep where people will still mistake you for that. And there's obviously nothing wrong with being Indian, but it's just more the sense of that they invalidate your identity. And everybody should have the respect and the honor of having an identity and being, safe in who they are. But it's just to say that it goes deep. And I think our people, it's hard for a lot of people to process it because it just is tied with like our foundational values here, either in this country or in Mexico itself.
Well, yeah, because even in Mexico it happens, and like I would always see it in novelas or like like I remember La Rosa de Guadalupe, where I think it was a little girl who was morenita, and they'd be like, oh, you're like you're in India. And I remember they would like blurt it, like they would like censor it. Yeah, they would bleep it, but you knew that what they were saying, because there was other episodes where you would like hear it, and then eventually now they kind of just like blurt it out. And you even see it within that in Mexico, like they still have that, and growing up with that of like you see a lot more I guess light-skinned actresses, right? And you kind of grow up seeing that a lot. So
I mean, think about like the wealth that Spain accumulated as a result of having colonized this land. I think I'm like, oh my gosh, in Spain they have siesta, they take naps in the middle of the day. That's so cool. And I'm like, why though? Like, why, why are they so relaxed, but we have to think about that. It's like everything has a root, and I think that that's what a lot of us are doing in this End Chancla culture movement is like we're rerouting. We're saying like Chancla culture is actually colonizer culture. And so we're trying to undo a lot of the harm that colonization has done upon our families, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's religious dogma, or whether it's, gender roles and norms. And it's possible to undo it. I think, I think it's going to take us a long time because I don't have the expectation anymore that I'm going to break every cycle of harm in this one lifetime. Like maybe I'm lucky to live 80, 85 years. I'm not going to undo, so many generations that have been impacted by this. But I'm going to raise my kids to be aware of it, and I'm going to raise my kids to break even more cycles, and that's how we're going to undo it.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
And I guess before my last question before we get to Brennan, since you did mention this, how do you see Latinx parenting evolving and growing in the future?
I have a very optimistic view because we're having this conversation right now. The LP page has grown so much, and I never expected that, honestly. Like I said, when I went into the work, I was like, I don't think that people are ready for these conversations. And so I feel very affirmed. I feel very hopeful. I also recognize that violence is still very much normalized in our families, and that people still advocate for, this youth did this bad thing. It must be because they didn't get enough chancletazos at home, and it's like, well, if you look at the prison population, you look at a lot of the brown and black men that are in prison, the majority of them, more than 90% of them, actually, this is fact, more than 90% of them did experience corporal punishment in the home. And so to make us believe that in order for, you know, kids to be raised in the right way, they have to be hit, or they have to be degraded, or they have to be taught respect in these ways that don't offer them respect, it's just not true.
Yeah.
That's insane. That is actually an insane statistic. Yeah, because the whole point of, I guess, if you were somebody who was trying to hit your kid, is because you think it's going to raise them to become more respectful, right? Respect through fear, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you see it through statistically, there's evidence that shows that it is not true. It actually does the opposite.
Yeah.
That's so insane.
There's another statistic that I find really powerful, and it's that 90% of all children are at least whacked, like hit with corporal punishment, at least once before they turn 1.
Really?
Wow.
Yes.
Before they turn 1 year old.
Before they turn 1 years old.
Wow, that's
Toddler.
insane.
Like when they're starting to like a little smack or like a little nalgadita. Yeah.
What?
That's insane.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, I think I saw in one of your captions, you put that children of marginalized groups are some of the most oppressed people on the planet. And I think that's so true because, I mean, we basically offer kids like almost to no respect. And I immediately started thinking about my nephew, about how I know he understands me, like in ways that, because when I was a kid, I remember one of my pet peeves was when adults would talk to me as if I couldn't like understand. Like, oh, they would either dismiss how I feel, or they would dismiss my ability to register whatever they were going to tell me. And in my head as a little kid, I could still remember being like, I understand, like I completely understand what you guys are talking about. So whenever I talk to my nephew, he's only 5 years old, but I know he can understand a lot. So if he asks me about something, like something that I know is kind of complex, like he asked me about gravity recently, I full-fledged, like I explained to him what gravity was. I know maybe he doesn't fully like understand because it's a sophisticated topic, but I offered him at least the respect to where I'll tell you what it is, and then it's up to you to see if it'll eventually you'll figure it out. Yeah.
That's why I'm like, you're not a parent, but you are in a relationship to kids, right? Like, and so I'm like, this is for everybody. Like, it's not just for parents, because at some point you're going to engage with a kid. At some point, you know, you might be a teacher or somebody who is in a relationship with a nephew, but you have to understand that kids deserve that respect that you're talking about, you know, and if you were not modeled that respect, it's going to be hard for you to respect kids.
Yeah.
Because you weren't modeled that when you were a kid.
Yeah, and I think for me, I always think about, especially with kids, I'm always like, man, I'm so awkward with kids. Like, I don't know how to, like, talk to them. And it goes to the thing of, like, I know that they, like, understand me, but I still see them as, like, so small that I'm kind of, like, I don't know how to communicate to them. And I know that a lot of that, too, is just, like, in school when they'd be like, oh, like explain to this, like, if you were to explain to this to a 5-year-old. And I'm like, I get what you mean, but I'm like, I feel like a 5-year-old still gets whether I say it this way or not, you know? But I've always said to myself, I'm like, I'm always really awkward with kids, and I don't know how to communicate with them as much, which is why, like, I sometimes have a little difficulty with, like, my nephew. Like, I feel like my relationship isn't as strong as, like, my brother's, but I feel like I do try my best because he is family, and, like, he's my nephew. Like, he's our first nephew. So, like, with him, I, like, try, and, like, also I was away when he was first born. So, like, I was gone for, like, the first few months that he was born. So, like, this time I also take it as to, like, kind of help that relationship with us because I wasn't around when he was growing up. So I'm like, I try my best, at least with him. I was like, at least try with him. With, like, other kids, I also try because, like, I think through that, it taught me a lot of, like, when people also say, like, oh, like, fuck them kids. And, like, this kid was, like, being, like, a really harsh kid. To me, I feel like I get a further understanding of, like, they're just kids. Like, sometimes they just don't know. And I think also, like, seeing how some parents do yell at their kids, I'm like, I feel like I should be the nice adult to them. Like, I should be the good experience for them. Like, even though it should come from their parents, but it's like they're still interacting with me, and I'm going to try my best to have them have a good moment with another adult.
And that's beautiful, bro, because I think one of the things that I'm kind of learning through this podcast is that I think when you learn how to communicate and have healthy relationship with children, you learn how to have a healthy relationship with, like, your inner child. So, like, some of the methods that you can use on other children, you could also use on yourself. Yeah. Like, why am I feeling this way? Like, am I offering myself validation in my emotions? Am I offering myself respect? So I think it's beautiful. I think you're doing a good job as somebody who sees you interact with my nephew. I think you're doing good, bro. I think it's just a process. You'll be okay.
Yeah. I think also for me, it's just like because I'm a woman and like eventually I'm going to be a mom. Like, I think to me, I always am like, I know that one of the biggest things that I want to do is that I want to read a lot of books. Like how you said when you had gotten pregnant and you started reading, like I want to read just so that I can know how to raise a child. Like, again, those resources weren't there for my mom, so, and they are here for me, so I'm kind of like, I want to do that. And like I'm getting to an age, like I'm 26, and like kids are still like a little far in my future, but I'm still like, I want to know a little more before I actually have them, whenever that is. Things can happen, life happens. Things can happen. And to me, I'm always just like, I just want to be like the best mom that I can be, for my child. And I know that like I am also well aware that there might be something where like my trauma does go down to them of like what I lived. But I'm kind of like, I want to do my best. And I feel like, again, like I feel like my mom did the best that she could with us. And like she still is, she's still my mom,
Yeah.
like she's still trying to do her best with us now, especially because we still live with them and stuff. And so like I want to better myself so that I can be better for my future kids and stuff. And like to me, I recently saw this post that I was also going to mention. It says, the fact that you worry about being a good mom means you already are one. And I thought that was like the best thing that I had seen, because I was like, bro, like I generally want to be a good mom to my kids. And like, again, like I said, like I educate myself a lot. I educate myself on a lot of things because of the fact that like eventually if my kid is like, oh, I don't feel like I'm a girl, I feel like I'm this way, like I want to understand what that means. Because like to me, I grew up just being a woman, like that's all I know. I don't know anything besides that. And to eventually hear if my kid says something where they're like, I don't feel the way that you assign me, then I'd be like, okay, like what are the steps, or what can I do as a parent to be there for you? And especially as us growing up as brown kids, like how can I be there for you growing up as another brown kid, Because, like, I feel like families live differently, and you see it in shows, too. Like, we've been watching Full House. So,
Yeah,
like,
we have, yeah.
we've been
It was
watching
funny when
Full
you
House.
brought it up,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, because we grew up watching that, but we also grew up watching, like, like Fresh Prince and, like...
Uncle Phil was like a dad.
Yeah.
Dude. He was like, oh, my gosh. Like,
Yeah.
it could be like
So you got to see like a lot of those things, but also like a lot that you get to see in these different shows that I always realized was that like, of course, like in Full House, they're all just a whole bunch of like, it's a white family, and then I get to see other shows that are like black and brown shows, and you get to see how they raise their kids in the show. And sometimes they have the talk, right, about like if a police like comes up to you, how you should act. So, like, I remember there was a scene, this was from, like, Grey's Anatomy, where they were explaining to their black son that, like, if you see a cop, like, don't talk back, always have your hands out, like, make sure that they're, like, aware of, like, where your hands are. Don't do anything, don't move, like, just respond to what they say, and you get to see just, like, how different groups and different cultures kind of grow up raising their kids because of the way that they look. And I thought that was like the craziest thing that I had ever realized, that like we each live differently because of the way that we look. And that's why, like, to me, I always try to be more aware myself so that eventually with my kids, I can show them different ways of, and it sucks that, like for us, it has to be that way where like we have to show them a different way because of the fact, the way that we look. But I feel like I want to get to at least my family to be a little world where like, they're very open and accepting and inclusive, of all that. So what you do is like super inspiring, and just like how my brother said, like it's really beautiful to see that's what you're doing within like our culture.
Yeah, I think you're already a good mom too. Like I think just having that intention, like I think people underestimate how important it is to have the intention, right? Because I'm not a perfect parent. I yell, like ask my kids, have an interview with my kids, and they will tell you some stuff. But I don't have the expectation necessarily that I'm going to be the dad from Full House, or, like I don't have the expectation. I'm like, okay, I had a lot of trauma in my childhood. My mom had a lot of trauma in her childhood. My grandmother had a lot of trauma in her, like she was full on abandoned as a baby, I'm working through stuff. And so what I'm able to do in having connection with my daughter, with my younger two kids too, is is going to be something, you know. I bite my nails. Like, I've bit my nails my whole life. I've had anxiety my whole life. And my daughter, my 11.5-year-old, doesn't bite her nails. And that was such an emotional like realization for me last year when I like looked at her nails. They were all long and pretty. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I broke this cycle for her. She doesn't have this level of anxiety that I had that led me to like bite, you know, down to the skin sometimes. Yeah. And so it's those little things that are like so affirming that she comes and still snuggles me. I would never at 11.5 years old, I was not there anymore where I felt like I could go and snuggle my mom and, you know, she would like wrap her arm around me. Like that didn't happen. And so the fact that my daughter can come to me and we have that really strong relationship, I'm like, this feels good. This is foundation. What we're doing here is setting foundation. So when you're talking about raising the kids within the family and having the family be that safe space, they're going to go out there and they're going to know what abuse looks like right away. You know, they're going to be like, I didn't experience this. This is weird. No, I know how to set boundaries because my parents gave me the level of practice to be able to set boundaries even with them. Yeah. You know, I could say no to my parents and they would hear me out. And a lot of the kids that, you know, at least when I was growing up, like we didn't have that.
Yeah. No, yeah. I feel that when like, especially when they say when you like stand up to your parents, when you're like, no, not this way, especially as adults, it still is a little hard where it's like you're talking back, right? But it's like, no, like now I'm defending myself now that I'm older. Like I can give my own opinion on certain things now.
That's brave as shit.
Yeah. I feel like I haven't really done that with like my parents, but like I feel like now there is a certain respect because of like we're adults now. Yeah. But there is still that thing of like we don't talk back to each other. We just are like, okay, this happened. You know, we can communicate now. Compared to like when I was younger, I was just more like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to stay mad. That's it. But now it's like I'm an adult. I can communicate. I can use my words now. Like I can tell you. And there's no hard feelings. It's always just us talking and that's it.
Yeah. There's an interesting dynamic that happens when you have a child and then your parents want to tell you how to raise your child. And this comes up a lot in my work when I talk to families. It's like, how do I establish a healthy boundary with my parents or with some of the older adults in my family who are telling me to spank and who are telling me to hit and who are telling me that I'm a bad parent if I don't spank my kids. Yeah. And that's something that I've experienced too. My dad would say, you know, solo con una nalgadita se le quita, you know, and I'm like, but I think over time they've seen that I'm raising kids that are respectful, you know, that are connected to me, to them, like that they are just genuinely like really great kids, you know? And so I think that they're learning a little bit from me too. My dad just a couple years ago was like, you know what I just learned? And I was like, yeah, papi. And he's like, I learned that you shouldn't compare your kids. I was like, you're 72. You know, like, you're 72 years old. I'm like, okay, pues nunca es muy tarde. Yeah. Like, it's fine. You know, you can learn that now. But again, like I see my parents as also having needed that parenting. And sometimes in our cultura, because our parents left their parents, like my mom left her mom when she was, 14 and had to come work here. And so she didn't get that experience of being like nurtured by her mother. And so it's going to, again, just be so much harder for her to do that for her children, and then now that I'm parenting in different ways, she may feel criticized, right? My parents may feel criticized and be like, oh my gosh, like, are you saying that because you're not spanking your kids that I did the wrong thing? Like that's something that maybe they don't even recognize consciously, but it does come up.
Oh, wow. And that actually was wondering about that too, because I mean, I see it with my parents, with my older brother, since I have a nephew. But luckily there is not too much of a conflict there. I do definitely see the older generation being like, this is how you should raise your kids. And I see the newer generation being like, no, I think we should leave all that stuff behind. Yeah. And you know what? Yeah. I don't blame them, I guess, because I can imagine that it does feel a little bit like an attack. Because it's like, oh, are you kind of calling me like a shitty parent? Yeah. And it's really not like that. I think that, I like that phrase you use, wounded. I think that sometimes we're just wounded and we unintentionally continue to wound our children. And if you look at it through that way, the next generation will try to just remedy that and heal them. Yeah. So now I know what to say in case I ever have kids and my mom is like, well, what's that about?
Yeah. I mean, I guess on that note, because just based on what we're talking about, the question I had for you was, what advice do you have for Latinx people who are trying to heal wounds they may have suffered during their own childhood?
Yeah.
And I guess I'm more leaning towards the aspect of people who don't have kids, because I know we've touched a lot about, getting to the privilege of getting to heal that through the raising your own child and stuff like that. So that was the question I had for you.
Yeah, that's a really big question because it requires a lot of bravery. Like, I think a lot of us who were taught to respect our parents sometimes feel like by questioning our parents, it feels kind of disrespectful. Like, it feels like we don't want to cross the line. We don't want to seem like we're not grateful for the sacrifices that they made. We don't want to seem like we're being disrespectful, right? There's a lot of activation of our own childhood wounds when we start to feel like maybe we're not honoring our mother and father, as the 10 Commandments say, right? So there's also that. Yeah. So it takes a lot of bravery. It takes a lot of patience, like with our process. Like I said earlier, I'm not going to expect to heal 500 years of colonization in this one lifetime. I'm going to be healing what I can heal in myself. And that's a daily process. That's a daily practice. And I'm going to pass down something that's a little bit different to my kids. And if I don't have kids, then really to whoever, right? I feel like you can apply parenting to anything. Like, I can understand that you have an inner niño, that you have an inner niño, and I can approach in that way, not in like, oh, you're just a kid, but in like, you have feelings, your feelings are valid. Like you were saying earlier, right? It's like you can kind of look at a child and be inspired to kind of recognize that that's still in you and recognize that we're all kind of still children. And that allows you to not take things personally, right? That allows you to see people for their intentions. That allows you to hold boundaries because you know that they're not necessarily attacking you. They have thorns that have developed that are to protect themselves, our parents or our friends or whoever. And so our job is not necessarily to tell you like, oh, you have thorns, like you're wounded and this is all your fault. But it's really just to protect my inner niña, and to say, I won't tolerate this anymore. I think boundaries are a really good example of the way that a lot of us are already breaking that cycle, right? Where it's like, I'm not going to take it on. I'm not going to take it personally. I'm not going to people please. I'm going to tell you, this is my line and I'm not good with you crossing that line, right? I had that experience once with my mom not that long ago where she came into the kitchen and she cleaned the kitchen. I was like, I'm so grateful that my mom cleans my kitchen sometimes. That's so cool. And then I came in and I was making my kids lunch and she got upset with me that I was in my own kitchen making lunch for my kids because she had just cleaned it. And I was like, no, like you can't be mad at me for being in my kitchen right now, And she got kind of upset and like left actually and was like hurt because I had set that boundary. And at the same time, I'm like, I'm not trying to be mean. Like I'm not being a bad daughter, but because I've already done a lot of that like internal work to know like I'm actually not a bad daughter for saying that my needs are valid, And I think one of the pieces that I can give is to affirm to anybody, like, just because we grew up feeling like we're bad daughters or bad sons because we're going against the wishes of our parents, that's not necessarily the truth, and it shows not our value, but it shows like the work that still needs to be done in the older generations too.
Wow.
Yeah, that's very impactful. Yeah, I like what you said a lot. I think it's important to kind of approach people and yourself with that knowledge of like, oh, there's still an inner child inside of me. But I like that you added that like not treating yourself or other people like you're just a kid. I thought that was very impactful.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even treat kids like, oh, you're just a kid. I'm just like, oh, tell me, like, I'm curious. I want to know, like, what, and my kids honestly have been that inspiration to like reconnect to that part of myself too. Cause I'm like, oh my gosh, the way that you stop and you look at this roly-poly. I want to stop and look at this roly-poly like that, and I think, and you can attest to this, like I'm very much like always in wonder and awe. I'm like, look at this, and I feel like that's only made possible because I have that like child spirit that is nurtured by my kids.
I wanted to add, are there any specific stories or experiences from your work that highlight, the power of addressing that multi-generational trauma?
I mean, I've been doing this for like 15 years. I want to name this one experience that I had where, this one when I was working in the agency, the mental health agency, I went into a transitional home. And so a lot of them were addicts and a lot of them were, in recovery, and they had classes that they had to go to. And I had a 10-week series that I was running with them. And this one young man, like a little cholito, he was probably 18, 19, like, and in this transit, I'm like still a kid, like still growing. And the session that I had led was all about needs. And it was all about every behavior that you express is an attempt to meet a need, right? So if you are doing drugs or if you are drinking alcohol, like that is going to meet a need for something for you, right? For safety, a lot of times, for space to check out, like whatever it is, like that's going to meet a need. And so my approach was always like, you're not bad. Like nobody is bad. You've been taught, you've been told your entire life that you're bad, and it's not true. And so I'm telling them, these are the needs that we have. We have a need for safety. We have a need for autonomy. We have a need for affection. We have a need for attention. We have all of these needs. And when those needs are not met, you're going to feel a certain way, and that feeling is going to turn into a behavior. And so you can't take behavior personally because it's connected to a need. So I'm telling them this, and then the class ends, and then this one, muchacho comes back, and he's just like, I gotta tell you something. Like, can I tell you something? And he like won't even look me in the eye. And I'm like, yeah, I'm here, like sit down. And so I sit with him, and he's like, nobody's ever told me that. And I was like, told you what? And he's like, that my needs matter. And I was like, shit. Wow.
Yeah, wow.
And I was like, okay, I was like, well, they do. And hold on to that, and recognize. And I think that this is where like the outer work comes in, like the advocacy work, the political work comes in, because a lot of our families have not believed that their needs matter, right? And that they have valid wants for themselves and their families. Like the messaging has been, no, you over there. Like stay down, you're the échale ganas, like síguele, keep going. Don't rest, because otherwise you're, huevona or floja or whatever whatever my mom would call me. But I think that was like one of the examples of like something that was really impactful for me is that recognition that like, a lot of people don't know that their needs matter. A lot of people believe that they deserve violence. I had a señor, I talk about this in my book, I had a señor that really just said, when I was young, my mom gave me a bunch of chingazos and I straightened up, and now it's not working with my son. And his son was in a ganga, in a gang. And he's like, I don't know what to do anymore. Like I've beat him, and like I've tried everything I can do. And he's like, my mom would do it to me too, but I deserved it. Yo era bien vago. Like I deserved to get hit the way that I was hit. And I got really pissed that day, and I just was like, nobody deserves violence, Yeah. But I think coming in with that, it's like, and violence is not just the corporal. Like violence is anything that hurts or harms the mind, the body, or spirit of another living human being. And so no one deserves harm, right? People are going to experience adversity and diversity, hopefully, to your question. But nobody deserves harm. Like everybody deserves to get their needs met. And children are a great example of that, right? Looking at a child and saying like, you need love, you need attention, you need all these things. So do I, right? So do I. And so I think that, those experiences and working with the parents and working with the youth, actually, because he was youth, he was not a parent. But, he was able to kind of be in that space and think about his inner niño.
I think it's really interesting and I guess impactful for me that you refer to it as violence. It's just a small thing that I noticed, because I feel like when it comes to like, disciplining your kids, I always hear that. It's like, oh, it's just a hit. It's just a smack. It's just discipline. But hearing the word violence, I guess, reframes it, because that's what it is, right? You're beating a kid. You're hitting a child, So I think that's a really interesting word that you use.
Yeah, let's talk about it a little more, because a lot of the messages that I get are like, there's a difference between discipline and abuse. Like if I post an anti-spanking something, everyone's like, oh, there's a difference between violence or abuse and discipline. Like there is, right? There is. And I actually don't use the word abuse. Like you won't see me on social media using the word abuse because it's very subjective. But when you are expressing violence towards a child or towards yourself, because a lot of the violence is internalized, right? They've made us believe that we're not worthy of having our needs met. So to violate our own needs, like, is very commonplace sometimes in our families. And when we talk about, you know, the fact that discipline, in order for a child to have discipline, they need to be in a state in their brain where they're able to learn. And if you are hitting a kid, you're putting them in a state of protection and survival where they actually can't even learn what you're asking them to learn, right? So they're learning fear. And maybe they're like, well, I was afraid of my parents and that means that I respected them. And I'm like, no. Like there's a very big difference between fear and respect. But I think that it's been really important for me to kind of recognize the impacts to the brain of not just the physical chancletazos, but the verbal chancletazos, the emotional chancletazos, like calling a child, you know, a jerk, or calling a child like a huevona, as I was called. And that does harm. You know, it does harm, and it is violating to the child's sovereignty and integrity and spirit and all of that. So I've been violent, right? My kids will say, like, my daughter will say, you're being violent with your words right now. I'm like, shit, she's right. You know, I am being violent with my words right now. And so just kind of naming that violence almost destigmatizes it so that we can all understand that we all have the capacity to be violent.
Yeah.
You know?
I think I was hoping you could touch on this a little more when you talked about the distinction between fear and respect. I guess the reason I want you to touch on that is because when you were saying that, in my head, I was thinking, well, what is the difference? You know? And I think a lot of people, or I guess a lot of people who have, my parents never hit me, but I think I'm assuming that a lot of people who have that aspect of like, oh, I got hit and I turned out okay. Like, I respect my parents. I would never say that to my parents because I get beat, you know? Because I hear that from like my dad, where he talks about like, oh, that wouldn't fly with my mom, you know, like, you know, stuff like that. So I was wondering if you could elaborate that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to hear from y'all. Like, what do you think the difference is between respect and fear?
Respect. I feel like with respect, you feel as though you can be open and honest with your parents no matter what the situation is. And because there's this level of comfort that they give you. Mm-hmm. While fear is, I just feel like no matter what I say, they're just going to hear the negative of it. Yeah. And I'm going to have to be prepared for the physical discipline of what they're going to do. And I feel like with fear, it's a lot harder to see love as opposed with respect. Respect is all love. Yeah. So that's the way I see it. Julie, what do you think?
I feel like I see it the same way because the whole time I was like, bro, we have the same parents. Like, that's true. Yeah, I was like, the way that they are with you is the way that they are with me, kind of thing. I know the dynamic is different because like he's a boy and I'm a girl. But yeah, I would say in the same thing of like, yeah, the respect is that you're just very comfortable enough and you respect my feelings as much as I respect yours, right? And then the fear is that like, I don't even want to tell you about it because like I'm scared of like what you're going to say because like I know that your answer is going to be something opposite, that you're not really hearing me in a way, right? It's the same way because it's like,
yeah, like you're not being seen.
Yeah, because it's like, yeah, they're more in the negative of like, I always think of, there used to be also that meme where it's like, oh, I tell my mom like, oh, I was out with my friend and this happened and blah blah, and then my mom is like, you were out with your friends? I thought I said you couldn't go out. Like they're more in like the area that you shouldn't be in instead of like the actual area that you want them to like worry about. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Like they're what is it? They're listening, but they're not hearing you. It's basically the gist of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I see it as like a difference in power dynamic, right? Mm. Whereas respect, like you're really sharing power and there's mutuality and you're like, I'm going to demonstrate respect to you and I'm going to listen to you so that you can learn what that feels like and then you're able to offer that back.
Yeah.
When it's fear, it's very power over. And so it's like me as a power holder, as an adult who's bigger than you, who has basically control over your entire life, I can decide what happens to you. Mm-hmm. And so if I am just being my authentic self as a child, but I've learned that my parents don't necessarily like or approve of who I am as a kid, that's going to create a lack of safety in me. And that lack of safety is that fear, right? But the respect doesn't have that lack of safety in it. So the respect, like you were saying, you're able to kind of approach your parents. You're going to not feel afraid that they're going to judge you, that they're going to give you advice right away, that they're going to try to brush off whatever you're experiencing, which so many of us have experienced, but that they're actually, they're going to sit there and hear you out and see you for who you are. And that's a demonstration of respect, which allows us to kind of know what that is and be out into the world being respectful because we've been modeled it, not because we're afraid that somebody's gonna, and I experience this sometimes with elders of mine, like they call me and I feel like I'm in trouble. Like I've had that happen where like one of my teachers was like texted me a few weeks ago and was like, I need to talk to you about one of your newsletters. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm going to get yelled at. It was a really good conversation and I learned a lot. Like he's my elder and I have a respect for him. But my initial reaction was like, oh my gosh, like, me va a gritar? Like, am I in trouble? And so a lot of us walk around feeling like we're going to be in trouble. Like at any given moment, I'm going to get seen by this person this way, or I'm going to, like, it's a feeling that you get. And a lot of that comes from that dynamic that we had with our parents in childhood is like, I'm preconditioned to be afraid of judgment. I'm preconditioned to be afraid of being in trouble or saying the wrong thing because I often did. And I often was when I was a kid. Right. And so how beautiful would it be if we raise kids to feel like they deserve their voice to be heard, that their needs deserve to be met? Like how wonderful would that be? Like to your question from earlier, what do I see for Latinx futures? I see possibility. I see empowerment. I see thriving. Like there's no other choice for me.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on it. I know I saw it on your post too, and how you mentioned it right now about like how we tell kids to like respect their elders, right? Or like I think in your post it said like how we tell kids that they should like deben de saludar a todos like in the room, and that just means like eventually kind of like they struggle with like telling you because you've kind of forced them to kind of always say hi to people when they're not even comfortable enough to like do those things. So you put them in that uncomfortability, already.
Yeah, it's like an unhealthy cycle that you continue to create, because if they feel as though they're afraid to even tell you what they're going through, then they're only going to continue to maybe not have that guidance that you could offer. And it creates like more negative feelings, because I think about it of like friends that I grew up with who were afraid to tell their parents that they were having some issues, like with either people at school or some personal issues. It would have maybe have helped a lot if they had just told somebody, but because they didn't have that safety at home, it never felt like they had peace either at home or out in public. So it leads to like anxiety and a lot of like unhealthy behavior that just continues to be like a cycle because you were raised with fear.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's kind of like a sad position to be in, because I'm assuming it makes you feel very lonely, right? Because it's like, well, my parents are right there. Like I have parents, but I can't tell them. So I'm sitting here alone, like almost stranded, kind of having to deal with this with myself. And I imagine like when you have like a fear-based relationship with your parents, outside of respect, like you said, you're cutting off like what I would assume, or I know is an important like lifeline, because parents go through like, I'm sure there's nothing I've experienced that my parents in general really haven't experienced, So to be cut off from that like support system, I'm sure is a very, it makes you feel very stranded in life, but yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the points that come in around respeto is that it's a way that we survive. Like we really did survive by respecting one another and respecting the land also, and respecting, the collective. Like there's a collectivism aspect that often gets left out of these conversations, especially in the parenting world and child development and brain development and all of this. Dr. Gabor Mate is starting to talk about it more. And it's the fact that, we're trying to be a collectivist culture in an individualistic environment and society. And so that's where a lot of the disconnect happens, where you and I were raised much more individualistic. We were focused on our healing. Our parents were not necessarily raised that way. And so if you look at it like a continuum, and this is the work of Dr. Manuel Samaripa from the Institute of Chicano Chicana psychology, where he talks about the individualism and collectivism continuum. And so any value that we're teaching is somewhere on that continuum, right? And so respeto, either you kiss every single person at the party or you are disrespectful, right? And then on the other side of it is the individualism, where it's like, you don't have to say hi to you, and you don't even have to look at anybody. Like if it makes you uncomfortable, no. Yeah. And so there's a middle ground, right? And so when I'm working with families, I'm like, we have to figure out what our balance is. Like it all comes back to a balance. So we're not going to be super, in the collectivism, like the toxicity that sometimes happens where like I have to sacrifice my own identity in order to be accepted by my family. And then on the other side of it, like, F my family, like I'm just going to be myself and I don't necessarily need anybody, and so you kind of see those extremes and you're like, we have to find where we can land with each of those. So that's respeto, that's feminismo, that's personalismo, like all of these values that have helped us survive. I'm asking people to kind of reevaluate whether we still need those methods of surviving, right? Or whether we can create kind of our own culture now. Yeah. And now that, we've had space that we can understand history, like we can actually create what we want to create.
Yeah, definitely. I think a question I wanted to pose to you is, I know we've talked about a lot of pressing concerns and issues. In your experience, I wanted to ask what the most common and what the most pressing issue Latinx parents come to you with, and what advice you have for maybe some parent listeners.
Yeah, honestly, it's about the boundaries with the parents. Like that's really the big one, because we are such a collectivist culture. A lot of people come to me and they say like, how do I get my mom to understand why I'm doing things differently? Or how do I get them to stop kind of intruding, in a lot of the ways that I'm parenting? And so I hold a lot of compassion for that, because the parenting books, if I give you a recommendation of parenting books, it's not really going to speak on this issue of how do you integrate the whole family, right? And so I have a whole workshop called A Mi Manera that talks about how to set boundaries. But I think that it's really difficult, because when you are trying to navigate like the reparenting of your parents, right, as you're trying to navigate the parenting of your kids and then the reparenting of your own inner child, like that's a lot to hold, right? That's a lot for parents to hold, and it can generate a lot of stress for a lot of parents. So I think that would probably be the biggest one, the most common that I hear.
Just setting boundaries with your parents.
Setting boundaries with your parents. I think, a very common one is also just like, my kids have really big feelings and I don't know what to do with them. Like my kids have really big tantrums and like, I don't know what to do. Like I also sometimes don't know what to do, right? Like it just depends on like how regulated your nervous system is able to be. But, and there's also a lot of isolation. Like I think a lot of people have come and they've asked me like, how do you find your village? Like, how do you find your community? How do you find this collective? Because we say it takes a village, but then it's like, where is everybody? Yeah. And I think it takes a lot of creativity. When I was 23 and I had just had my daughter, I was really lonely. Nobody else was having babies. Like I didn't know anybody else that was pregnant or that had a child that was my age. And so I was very intentional about seeking that out. I've always been that way though. I've always been like, I can't really count on my family. I can't really count on like feeling safe here. So my friends have always been my safety. I've always had like, the priority to like prioritize my friends, because they have been really the ones that have helped me to survive as long as I've survived. And so that's a big question that I get, is like, how do you find your village? And what I would say to that is to not see yourself as a burden. Don't see yourself as somebody that's not worthy of having community. That's the first step, right? Because a lot of us are like, nadie me va a querer ayudar. Like no one's going to want to help me. So don't see yourself that way. Try not to see yourself. That's like a colonized mindset kind of way of being. And so the next step is actually to go out and to ask for that support, and to make friends. I'm like, go to a park. I had created a meetup group at the time, and just hang out where spaces where there's parents and other kids, and find that friend, find that village.
Yeah.
I guess a question that popped in my head as you were speaking was, do you think it's beneficial for everybody to read maybe a book like you're writing, or read a lot more about, parenting, even if you're not a parent? Because to me right now it does sound like a good idea, because it's like, I can reparent myself a little bit, or I can learn the things or I can learn to treat the things that my inner child is kind of asking for help about right now. So would you say it's beneficial to everybody to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important for anybody to learn about the way that brain development works. Like a lot of the conversation in parenting is about how does a child's brain develop? And so you want to know how your brain developed, right? And so that is going to create an awareness that I think is going to benefit your healing process. You also want to learn the history of your culture, like the history of your people. You want to learn as much about your ancestry as you can, because having a strong identity has shown for kids and for adults to be better for your mental health, to be better for your emotional health. Like having that cultural identity is really, really important. And so in addition to the parenting, to the brain development, to the child development, like really learning about your culture, your history, and then integrating those two has been, for me, what's been really powerful.
Wow. That's really impactful to hear. But I guess my final question to you before I send it over to Steve is what aspect of decolonized parenting do you think is the hardest for the community to accept?
Like, y'all have really good questions. I think we place a lot of pressure on ourselves, those of us that kind of recognize that there is something to change, right? It's like, oh my gosh, you're telling me I have to shift 50 or 500 years. I wish it was only 50 years. 500 years of colonization. And that feels overwhelming. You know, it feels really overwhelming to be like, wow, I'm awake now and I'm conscious of what has happened. And now it's my responsibility to do something different about it. And so I think that can feel really challenging internally, especially as you kind of look around at the world and you're like, everything's falling apart. It seems like, you know, no one really feels very connected or very, you know, there's no one I know right now that isn't struggling, at least a little bit, you know, when I really think about it. And to place that additional pressure to be a perfect parent for your kids is, I don't think, something that people need, you know. And so my approach is not to shame anybody. It's just to encourage people to kind of be in the truth of who they are and the truth of what is in capacity, and to see where one of us can help. You know, how can we support? But I think that can be a very isolating place to be, where it's like, I am wanting to talk about decolonization. I'm wanting to talk about re-indigenizing. I'm wanting to talk about rematriation. I'm wanting to talk about all these things, but I'm at a family party and no one wants to talk about these things with me, right? And so I know you have experience with this too, where, you know, the conversations are like right there, like right there. And yet there's not really anyone who has the willingness or the capacity. Like I remember telling my mom about Catholicism and just being like, what do you think was here? Because she was calling me a bruja. And I was like, what do you think was here? Like before colonization. And she's like, ay, ni lo quiero pensar, no me digas. And I was like, you're overwhelmed. Like it was very clear that she was overwhelmed, you know? And so I think that being somebody who wants to parent from that more liberatory, more decolonial mindset can be very lonely. It can be very isolating. And so this is why I go back to, you know, we have to find our communities and we have to be really good about nurturing them and keeping them strong.
Yeah.
Wow.
I just keep thinking of, right now as you were like talking, I just keep thinking about my mom. Because I'm like, I generally am like, I feel like she's healing a lot through like my nephew. And like, I feel like I can see her kind of healing through that. Because I'm like, especially like my parents, you know, there were immigrants that came here. All they had to do was work. And I think the way that we grew up, we didn't get to see them a lot because they had to work. They still raised us, again, like how I said, the best that they could, but they still had to both go to work all the time. So it was always just the three of us. It's us and like our older brother. He's 6 years older than me. So like he's 8 years older than Steve. And like he kind of raised us too. So he's like the third, to me, he was kind of like a third parent. But going back to like my mom, like I just feel like I see a lot of like her also trying to reconnect to her roots, where she is very much like, she says that like, if you're stressed, like go walk on the grass, like take off your shoes and go walk on the grass, because it's nice to be grounded through the earth and stuff. And like, she's been doing a lot of that and like a lot of like old practices. And just seeing that, and I feel like a lot of that with like my nephew, she like plays a lot and like she's always outside and stuff. And like, I don't know, to me, it just made me think of my mom and how like, I feel like she generally is like healing through like everything, because like one, she had already realized that she had the trauma, and then the other one was now it's like her healing herself as an adult. And like to see her like just, you know, you get to see your parents also grow. So it's like you see like my mom's also like getting old and stuff, and like to me, it always just makes me excited of when I eventually do have kids, because I know that again, I'm the only girl, so I feel like to them that's like a huge thing. Like my dad's gonna give me away, right? And like I'm gonna be pregnant, and like my mom, I know, is gonna be heavily involved, and like I understand her involvement in it, and I want her to be involved because I've seen her involvement with my older brother, and I think like to me, I just feel good that I do have, I guess, my village of like my brother and like especially my parents, my dad, my mom, and like knowing that like I need their guidance because I've seen the guidance that they've given my older brother, that I feel like I'm very confident that now they're going to give me a good guidance, which always makes me think about like, do I want to move out? Do I want to leave? Because I'm like, I really like that my mom is here and that she would help me, because like to me, I already enter in that panic of like, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, I'm going to find out that I'm pregnant. I am going to be happy, but I'm going to be like, now I have to raise a child. Like, and I'm going to be in that anxiety and fear of like, am I going to be good? Or like, what's going to happen with my body? And like, knowing that I have her there is just like what also excites me to see what happens with us and our family.
Yeah.
That's all that it made me think about. I'm like, oh, like my mom's healing, which is nice.
Yeah. I think you're never at any age that you're at, you can still grow. You could be like 90 and still like grow, which is what's like the beautiful thing about learning about all this. But my first question that I wanted to kind of throw to you. Yeah, go ahead. My first question that I wanted to kind of throw to you is that I understand that you're a first generation parent. And I wanted to ask if you felt as though your experience is different because of that aspect, and what advice you would give to other first generation, first time parents.
Oh, yeah. I do feel like it's a very unique experience. I think that because so many of us have this experience, like I don't necessarily feel very alone in it anymore, because I've been very intentional of bringing other people who share in a lot of similarities in my story. I think the way that it is a unique situation is that we are, again, like I see us as kind of like straddling these two cultures. You know, it's like I have my family that I grew up with. I have the experiences that I had with my mom, who was in survival because she was an immigrant, who was stressed out so much of the time because she was an immigrant. And I can't necessarily relate to everybody on that same thing, right? Because again, that stress, that experience caused trauma, you know, like it caused a lot of hardship to her and to her body. Like I see what it's done to her body, and to honestly, like a lot of the elders' bodies are just really overwhelmed, I guess, with a lot of the trauma and the stress that they have gone through. It's beautiful to hear that they're reconnecting back to their child selves by engaging with their grandkids. My mom also is. But I think that now that I have my own children, and especially in the last few years, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm actually going to have to take care of my mom. Like I'm actually going to have to be the one to take care of my dad too, you know, as the older daughter. Yeah. And I think that a lot of children of immigrants are in that position, especially those of us who are now, like I'm 36, so my parents are older, and that's not like the typical parenting experience, right? Especially when you're talking to families who are white, or families who are more privileged, right? Their parents have retirement funds. Like their parents are like, they're going to be good. You know, they don't want to be burdens on the middle generation. And for me, like I don't have a choice, right? And so it's navigating the reparenting again of my parents in a different way than I would have to if they were not immigrants, right? Because they didn't really have anything when they came here. Yeah. And so now it's on me to kind of be the one to make sure that they're good, you know, make sure that my kids are good, make sure that like whoever is around is okay, you know? And so I think that pressure definitely impacts parenting. You know, like I have to do a lot to keep myself regulated, to keep myself rooted, to keep myself like good. Yeah. To keep myself good, so that I can continue to provide, you know, so that I can continue to to be good for my kids emotionally and all of that, you know, so that I'm able to continue to set boundaries with my parents when I have to. And so it's taken a lot, like it's taken a lot of learning, a lot of practice, and a lot of strength to be able to kind of be this middle generation where I'm straddling these two cultures, but then I'm also like holding the realities of what it means to have immigrant parents who don't have a savings account, you know? So yeah, there's a lot of impact there.
Yeah. What's some advice that you would offer for other people who might feel like they're in similar situations?
Agárrate.
Like
hold on, you know,
Yeah.
like hold on, because I think it can be a very overwhelming experience for a lot of us. And again, find, like, you're not alone in it, you know, like find your village, find your pueblo, because there's other people that are going to feel validated from just hearing your story, and that validation and that acknowledgement is going to create some ease in that experience. You know, okay, just knowing I'm not alone in this feels better. It feels softer. It feels easier. It feels like I might be actually able to do this.
Well said. I wanted to ask, what was an eye-opening lesson you might have learned since you became a parent, and what contributed to this realization?
I've learned that this shit is so much harder than anybody could ever tell you.
Really?
Yes, it's wild. My sister is not a mother. She lives in New York. She's 10 years younger, as I mentioned earlier, and she does not want to be a parent. Like, she's just like, it's not for me. Like, I know what I want in my life, and it's not kids. And I don't blame her, you know, because the level of intentionality, at least the level of intentionality that I try to parent with, is hard. It's time consuming. I've made it my whole job. You know what I mean? Like, in order for me to be able to do this, I've had to make it my entire life, because I have to keep hearing it. Like, this conversation helps me because I can keep hearing it, and I can keep, you know, moving forward, knowing that this is my intention with my kids. And so I think, yeah, that's what I've recognized over the last 11 years. It's hard, and it's also worth it, because again, my daughter doesn't bite her nails anymore. You know, like, she's growing up different. She's going to have a different blueprint, a different framework. And then her children are going to be different if she chooses to have children, right? And so as hard as it is, and every year is like the hardest and the best in parenting, and I think any parents out there like can relate to this. It's like, I love this age. Ugh, I hate this age. Like, it's just as hard. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to kind of practice how to grieve and how to celebrate in that experience. You know, even when it's hard, it's like, okay, well, this is still trying to teach me something. Like, I'm still learning here. I've never parented through a pandemic. I've never parented, you know, with all of these different factors going on. And so I think we can recognize like our own strength and being able to do what we're doing as parents in this environment, in this system. And we can celebrate that. We can say, actually, no, we're badasses because we're breaking cycles, you know?
Yeah, I like that phrase too. I like my daughter doesn't bite her nails. I feel like that's so impactful because it seems so simple, but it actually says a lot.
I cried.
Yeah.
I cried, you know, and I want to make a post about it and like really kind of delve into it. I'm writing about it in the book a little bit too, but I'm just like, it's these little moments, you know, these small moments of breaking these cycles and of healing our collective traumas that we can't just kind of brush off. Like that's real. That's powerful.
It would work well on a shirt too. Like, my daughter doesn't bite her nails. It's just so symbolic.
We got our merch guy over here. Write it down.
Yeah, it's just so symbolic. But actually, my final question, because some of the questions I wanted to ask, you answered throughout the entire podcast. But once and for all, I wanted to ask you, how do we end Chancla culture?
Slowly. With a lot of patience. With a lot of honoring of the process of it, by not taking on any more shame than we've already felt, because our parents have been channels often of the shame that is inflicted by these oppressive systems, religious dogma, patriarchy, etc., white supremacy. So I think, just very slowly, with a lot of patience, and with a lot of intentionality. You know, I always talk about how the first thing that we have to do is reflect, right? Just recognize, like, okay, where am I? Like, in my timeline, right? Like, what happened before me? What's possible ahead of me? So we're reflecting on our day to, like, how did I parent today? Did I yell, etc.? And then after that reflection comes intention, right? We set an intention. Okay, I don't want to do that. I don't want to yell tomorrow. I want to have patience tomorrow. I want to, like, that's my intention. I want to raise my child to not bite her nails, right? That's an intention. And so once we have that intention, we have resource now, right? Like we have the internet, we have like so much access to information. And we also have to be very careful about what that information is, because if you Google like, why should I spank my kids? You're going to find articles about why you should spank your kids, you know? And so you have to also be very like calculated almost in what kind of information you take in. And then once you do that, it's practice, you know, and that practice is very, very hard when you don't have systems of support around yourself. So it also takes a lot of support and people that speak your language, that I can say, hey, my inner niña is feeling activated right now. And they're not going to be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, what is this, you know? Yeah. And so really sharing in that supportive environment with others is a big piece of it too. And then once we have that support and we're able to practice and we're able to kind of put down the chancla and recognize, you know, all of the things that have happened and set intentions daily for what we want. You know, a world without chancla culture is kind of what I'm envisioning, right? Just like we don't necessarily have to use violence in order to raise kids, to be respectful, to be well-rounded, all of those things. Then we advocate for others, you know, and then we step in and we say, okay, if I'm able to do this, then everybody should be able to do this. And so that's when, you know, he comes in and he goes and flips off city council and, you know, and because it is, you know, if a parent is not knowing where they're going to live, like they're impacted by housing injustice, or they're impacted by racism and discrimination, and they're impacted by all these things that causes that stress, we're only going to get so far in any chancla culture, right? Because it's like, I don't even have the time to think about that. Like, what are you saying? Like, put some food on my table, please. And so when we recognize that, we can better see that all parents deserve that. You know, we all deserve to parent with ease. We all deserve to have rest. And that's uncomfortable for us sometimes to rest because we're not used to it. We haven't been there for many, many years, you know. So I think kind of honoring that process and advocating for each other, I think that's how we end chancla culture.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to just go ahead and give a big thank you collectively to Leslie for Latinx Parent. She was an amazing guest today. It was an amazing conversation. I think everybody who was listening will at least find something that they resonated with. And I want to thank you for taking the time to come out here. I want to thank your partner, too, for sitting in.
Shout out to Fernando de Veras. You can find him on Instagram. He's
great. If you guys want to find out Leslie, find out all the work she does, I will leave the links in the description below. Julie, Brandon, you guys have anything else to add?
Well, I was mostly just curious about your tattoos.
Oh, yeah.
If they had any meanings.
All of them have many meanings. So I'll start with the first one. I think a lot of us relate to like identifying with the colibri. Mm-hmm. For me, it is about maternal ancestral protection. Like it's really my tita. Underneath are the 3 girasoles, the 3 sunflowers, which are my 3 babies. And it's like the bordado style because it's dope like that. And then on the other side is my half brain, half anatomical heart. And so this is like the integration of heart, mind, and then also like nature with the flowers, and then also the divine. So I see ending chancla culture also as like a spiritual process because it kind of recognizes us to kind of like see outside of ourselves, right? And so that has been helpful to me. And then above that one is the mamiposa. So that's, you know, motherhood as a catalyst for transformation. So parenting, like becoming a mom really transformed my life because I was able to see that child and recognize that she's a mirror of me. So that's my mamiposa. And then this one is the integration of like Aztec and Mayan culture in Mexico. And so at the center of it is the Inlakesh symbol, which means tú eres mi otro yo, which is like my symbol for community. And it's in one that I got.
No, yeah.
This one is my little sister and I got birthday cards to each other, we would say,
essentially we